Have you ever wondered where people slept before beds even existed? Tonight, we'll journey back hundreds of thousands of years to uncover the surprising history of one of humanity's most familiar inventions, from simple grass bedding to the comfortable beds we know today. Welcome to Sleepy Earth. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from, so leave your city in the comments and let's begin our journey together. Long before kings slept beneath carved wooden canopies, before soft mattresses, pillows, or blankets became ordinary parts of everyday life, there was only the ground. It sounds almost too simple to imagine. Every evening, as darkness settled over the landscape, our ancestors faced a question so ordinary that we rarely think to ask it today. Where can I sleep without dying before sunrise? That question may have shaped human history far more than the invention of the bed itself. Sleep has always been a biological necessity, but for most of human existence, it was also one of the most dangerous moments of the day. Closing your eyes meant surrendering awareness. Your hearing dulled, your reactions slowed, your body became still. For predators, parasites, and even rival humans, a sleeping person was often the easiest target imaginable. Long before people worried about comfort, they worried about surviving the night. If you picture prehistoric life through the lens of modern movies, you might imagine groups of people lying comfortably around a fire inside a spacious cave, wrapped in animal skins while flames kept danger away. Reality was probably much less romantic. Fire certainly became one of humanity's greatest allies, but its widespread and reliable control likely developed gradually over hundreds of thousands of years rather than appearing overnight. Even after fire became more common, it did not magically solve every problem. Smoke irritated the eyes and lungs. Fuel had to be gathered constantly. A fire left unattended could fade within hours, returning darkness to its full power. And beyond that circle of light, countless sounds continued. Rustling leaves, breaking branches, distant growls, insects moving through dry grass. Every unfamiliar noise had to be interpreted. Was it the wind, a harmless animal, or something far more dangerous? Archaeologists cannot travel back in time to watch people prepare for sleep, yet surprisingly, the ground itself has preserved quiet clues. Ancient cave floors, microscopic traces of plants, worn patches of sediment, and the distribution of stone tools all offer fragments of forgotten evenings. None of these discoveries tell a complete story by themselves, but together they suggest that sleep was rarely an afterthought. It demanded planning. Choosing the wrong place could have fatal consequences. A location that seemed safe during daylight might become a hunting route after sunset. A hollow that provided shelter from wind might collect cold air through the night. Ground that appeared dry could become soaked after evening rain. Every decision carried risks that modern bedrooms have almost erased from memory. Temperature may have been an even greater challenge than predators. Humans are remarkably adaptable, yet we lose body heat surprisingly quickly when resting. During the day, movement generates warmth. At night, metabolism slows, muscles relax, and the body naturally lowers its core temperature as part of healthy sleep. That process works beautifully inside insulated homes. On exposed ground, however, it creates a problem that physics has never negotiated with biology. The Earth itself constantly draws heat away from anything warmer resting upon it. Even on nights that feel pleasantly cool, direct contact with bare ground can steadily drain warmth from the body. This simple transfer of heat may explain why separating oneself from the Earth eventually became such an important step in human history, although that realization likely came much later. Before anyone imagined lifting a sleeping platform above the ground, survival depended on choosing the least dangerous patch of earth available. Caves often appear as the obvious answer, but caves presented their own uncertainties. Some sheltered dangerous carnivores long before humans arrived. Others flooded seasonally or trapped smoke from fires. Darkness inside caves also limited visibility, making unexpected encounters even more hazardous. Evidence from prehistoric sites suggests that people did occupy caves repeatedly, yet they also lived in open-air camps, temporary shelters, rock overhangs, and countless environments that left few traces behind. This reminds us of an important reality. The archaeological record is not a complete archive of human life. It is simply the portion that happened to survive. Much of what people built from branches, grasses, leaves, and animal hides disappeared thousands of years ago without leaving recognizable remains. That absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence that such sleeping arrangements never existed. Instead, it reflects the fragile materials from which everyday life was often constructed. If predators were one danger and cold another, parasites formed a quieter enemy. Long before mosquitoes carried disease across continents or fleas became infamous during later epidemics, insects had already perfected the art of feeding on sleeping animals. A motionless human offered an easy opportunity. Ticks, mites, biting flies, lice, fleas, and countless other small creatures likely made nighttime far less restful than we imagine. Modern research on animal behavior reveals that many mammals devote enormous effort to selecting clean sleeping sites, often abandoning nests after parasites accumulate. Some scientists have wondered whether early humans gradually developed similar habits, rotating sleeping areas, or selecting locations with fewer insects. Direct evidence remains limited, but the possibility fits patterns observed throughout the natural world. Humans, after all, did not invent sleep. We inherited millions of years of evolutionary pressures surrounding it. Looking at our closest living relatives offers another fascinating window into the distant past. Chimpanzees and gorillas do not simply collapse wherever exhaustion catches them. They build sleeping nests. Each evening, chimpanzees weave branches together into elevated platforms, carefully selecting locations that provide stability and protection. The process is surprisingly sophisticated, involving choices about tree species, branch flexibility, and structural support. Young chimpanzees spend years learning this behavior from older members of the group. Scientists often point to these nests as evidence that constructing a dedicated sleeping place predates modern humans by millions of years. Of course, chimpanzees are not our ancestors, and their behavior should not be viewed as a direct snapshot of prehistoric human life. Both lineages have evolved independently for a very long time. Still, their nightly construction of sleeping platforms raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the desire to create a specific place for sleep runs much deeper in evolutionary history than the invention of the bed itself. The earliest humans may not have begun with furniture. They may have begun with the instinct that where you sleep matters. Group living added another layer of complexity. Sleeping alone was almost certainly riskier than sleeping together, but gathering in larger numbers created new challenges. Space became limited. Fires required careful positioning. Infants cried. Older individuals needed protection. Someone may have remained awake while others slept, although exactly how such responsibilities were organized remains unknown. Some anthropologists have proposed that early humans adopted staggered sleeping patterns, with different individuals naturally waking and sleeping at different times, providing a kind of accidental nighttime vigilance. Studies of some modern hunter-gatherer communities have revealed overlapping sleep schedules that keep at least one person awake through much of the night. Whether this pattern stretches deep into prehistory cannot be stated with certainty, but it illustrates how social behavior may have quietly enhanced survival long before formal night watches existed. There is another overlooked aspect of sleeping on the ground: visibility. During daylight, humans rely heavily on vision. At night, vision becomes dramatically less reliable, especially before artificial lighting. A sleeping place needed to balance concealment with awareness. Too exposed, and predators or enemies could approach easily. Too hidden, and escape routes became difficult. This delicate compromise may explain why many prehistoric camps appear near natural features, offering both shelter and open views of surrounding terrain. The landscape itself became part of the sleeping environment. Hills, rocks, trees, rivers, and vegetation all influenced the odds of surviving until morning. It is tempting to think of sleep as an interruption between meaningful events, yet for early humans, nighttime may have been every bit as consequential as daytime hunting or gathering. Dreams, too, almost certainly played a role. We cannot know what ancient people believed about dreams hundreds of thousands of years ago, but later cultures, across nearly every continent, assigned them extraordinary significance. Some viewed dreams as messages from ancestors. Others saw them as warnings, prophecies, or journeys into unseen worlds. It is possible that such interpretations emerged much later, after symbolic thought became increasingly sophisticated. Yet the mystery of dreaming itself has accompanied humanity for as long as sleep has existed. Even today, neuroscience continues uncovering new questions about why dreams occur and what functions they may serve. The ground where our ancestors slept was not merely a place of physical rest. It may also have been where imagination, memory, fear, and storytelling quietly evolved together beneath unfamiliar stars. Perhaps the greatest misconception about prehistoric sleep is the assumption that early humans simply endured uncomfortable nights until civilization finally rescued them with furniture. Evolution rarely rewards creatures that tolerate unnecessary disadvantage. If sleeping arrangements remained unchanged for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, they likely worked well enough under specific environmental conditions. Comfort, in the modern sense, may not have been the objective. Efficiency, warmth, safety, and adaptability mattered far more. Every improvement probably emerged gradually through countless small observations rather than sudden invention. Someone noticed that dry leaves insulated better than bare soil. Another discovered that sleeping near certain plants reduced insects. Others preferred higher ground after heavy rain. None of these decisions required written knowledge or formal science. They reflected something equally powerful: accumulated experience passed from one generation to the next. Yet even the best sleeping place on the ground could never fully solve one unavoidable problem. The earth remained beneath you, cold, damp, alive with insects, and shared with countless other creatures. Sooner or later, somewhere, someone appears to have wondered whether survival could be improved, not by changing the ground itself, but by leaving it behind entirely. It is impossible to identify who first imagined that idea, or whether it emerged independently in many different places. Archaeology has not given us that answer, but the moment humans began separating their sleeping bodies from the earth, even by only a few inches, they quietly started one of the most transformative stories in everyday history. Long before bedrooms became symbols of comfort, privacy, or luxury, they began with a far simpler ambition: to survive one more night. Imagine kneeling on the floor of a cave almost 200,000 years ago. There are no woven blankets, no wooden frames, no pillows waiting at the end of a long day. Yet before anyone lies down, someone quietly gathers armfuls of tall grass, another adds handfuls of fresh leaves. Layer after layer is spread across the ground with surprising care, not unlike someone today fluffing a mattress before going to bed. At first glance, it seems almost too ordinary to matter. After all, grass grows everywhere. But hidden inside that simple act is one of the earliest examples of humans deliberately changing their environment to improve the quality of sleep. Long before the first bed was built, humanity may have already invented something just as important: the mattress. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence comes from Border Cave, a rock shelter tucked into the hills of present-day South Africa. The cave itself overlooks a broad valley that has witnessed hundreds of thousands of years of human occupation. Archaeologists working there uncovered something remarkably delicate, buried beneath layers of ancient sediment. It was not wood, stone, or bone. Those survive well through time. Instead, they found microscopic traces of compressed grass, preserved under extraordinary conditions. Careful analysis suggested that people had intentionally laid down bundles of grass to create sleeping surfaces roughly 200,000 years ago. If that interpretation is correct, these are among the oldest known prepared bedding materials ever discovered. What makes the discovery so compelling is not simply its age, but its organization. The grass does not appear to have accumulated naturally through wind or flooding. It was concentrated into distinct layers, as though deliberately collected and arranged. Researchers identified several species of broadleaf grasses that would have produced a relatively soft, springy surface compared with bare earth. Even after thousands of generations, those tiny plant fragments still carry a quiet message. Someone cared enough about sleep to change the ground beneath them. That realization shifts the story of the bed in an unexpected direction. Comfort was not invented by civilization. Its roots reach astonishingly far into prehistory. Yet comfort alone probably does not explain the effort involved. Gathering enough grass to create a sleeping surface would have taken valuable time and energy. Hunter-gatherers constantly balanced effort against survival. Every unnecessary task carried a cost. If prehistoric families repeatedly built these grassy layers, they likely received benefits that outweighed the work required. One obvious advantage was insulation. Anyone who has slept directly on cold ground knows how quickly warmth disappears. Thick grass traps pockets of air between its stems, creating a surprisingly effective barrier that slows the transfer of heat into the earth below. Modern camping equipment uses the same basic principle. Foam pads, inflatable mats, and insulated sleeping bags all exist because losing heat downward remains one of the fastest ways for the human body to become cold. It is remarkable to think that people may have understood this relationship through experience alone, long before anyone could explain the physics behind it. The border cave bedding holds another mystery that has intrigued scientists even more. Mixed among the grasses were remains of aromatic leaves belonging to a plant known today as Tarchonanthus, sometimes called the camphor bush. This shrub produces naturally fragrant compounds that many insects find unpleasant. Modern communities in parts of Africa have traditionally used it for insect control, placing leaves inside homes or sleeping areas to discourage pests. Could people 200,000 years ago have discovered the same property? Some researchers believe that possibility deserves serious consideration. Others urge caution, pointing out that proving intentional, medicinal, or insect-repelling use from archaeological remains is extremely difficult. The leaves may have served several purposes at once, including providing scent, cushioning, or simply reflecting what happened to be growing nearby. Even so, the combination of grasses and aromatic plants invites a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the world's first mattress was also one of the world's first attempts at pest control. The more closely scientists examine ancient bedding, the more it begins to resemble a carefully engineered environment rather than a random pile of vegetation. At Border Cave, evidence suggests that old bedding was sometimes burned before new layers were added. Burning may have helped remove parasites, reduce odors, or clear accumulated debris. Once again, certainty remains impossible. Fire could have spread through abandoned materials for several reasons. But if the interpretation is correct, it would reveal an unexpectedly sophisticated routine. Remove old bedding, burn it clean, gather fresh plants, and rebuild the sleeping area. That sounds remarkably familiar. Modern people wash sheets, replace mattresses, and clean bedrooms for many of the same practical reasons, even though the materials have changed dramatically. Sleep, it seems, has always demanded maintenance. These discoveries also challenge another common assumption that prehistoric people accepted discomfort simply because they had no alternative. The archaeological record paints a different picture. Again and again, humans appear to have modified their surroundings in surprisingly thoughtful ways. Stone tools became sharper, fire became more controlled, shelters became more organized. Sleeping surfaces evolved alongside these innovations. Rather than accepting the world exactly as they found it, our ancestors continuously adjusted it in small but meaningful ways. The mattress may represent one of the clearest examples of this instinct. It required no metal, no advanced engineering, and no permanent architecture. It required observation. Which grasses stayed dry? Which plants remained soft after several nights? Which leaves discouraged insects? Which materials became moldy after rain? Every generation likely accumulated knowledge through countless evenings of trial and error. Of course, Border Cave is only one site. Archaeology rarely offers universal answers from a single discovery. Other ancient camps may have used different materials that left no recognizable traces at all. Soft moss, bark fibers, reeds, animal hides, feathers, woven branches, or combinations of these could all have served similar purposes depending on local environments. Organic materials disappear quickly under most conditions, leaving enormous gaps in the historical record. This means the oldest surviving mattress is not necessarily the first mattress ever created. It is simply the earliest one fortunate enough to survive long enough for modern scientists to find it. That distinction matters because it reminds us how incomplete the archaeological record truly is. Every preserved site is probably standing in for thousands that vanished without a trace. Looking beyond archaeology, the natural world provides intriguing parallels. Birds line nests with feathers, not simply for softness, but for insulation. Many mammals gather leaves before giving birth. Great apes carefully weave fresh vegetation into nightly nests, often selecting specific branches that create stable yet comfortable platforms. Humans did not invent the idea of modifying a sleeping place. We inherited an evolutionary tendency to improve rest whenever possible. What appears uniquely human is the growing complexity of those improvements. Over time, sleeping spaces became not only safer, but cleaner, warmer, and perhaps even healthier. Somewhere along that long journey, sleep transformed from a purely defensive necessity into something people actively optimized. There is another subtle clue hidden inside these ancient grass beds. They suggest planning for the future. Gathering bedding does not solve an immediate crisis like escaping a predator or finding food before starvation. Instead, it prepares for an event that has not yet happened, the coming night. That ability to anticipate future needs lies at the heart of many human achievements. Preparing a sleeping place required imagining tomorrow's discomfort before it arrived. In that sense, the mattress represents more than a collection of plants. It reflects a mind increasingly capable of shaping tomorrow instead of merely reacting to today. The simple act of making a bed, even one from grass, hints at a broader transformation unfolding inside the human brain. We often celebrate prehistoric innovations, such as stone blades, fire, or hunting weapons, because their purposes seem obvious. Yet the invention of bedding may have influenced survival just as profoundly. Better sleep supports stronger immune function, sharper thinking, faster learning, improved memory, and healthier physical recovery. Modern science continues uncovering just how deeply sleep influences nearly every system in the body. Early humans knew none of the biology, but they experienced the results firsthand. A group that slept slightly warmer, avoided more insect bites, or recovered more effectively from injuries may have enjoyed subtle advantages that accumulated across generations. Evolution often rewards small improvements, repeated over immense stretches of time. Interestingly, not every archaeologist agrees on exactly how these ancient bedding layers should be interpreted. Some emphasize that natural processes can sometimes rearrange plant material in surprising ways. Others argue that the repeated patterns observed at Border Cave strongly support intentional construction. This ongoing discussion reflects one of the strengths of archaeology rather than a weakness. New discoveries rarely end debates. Instead, they refine them. Every excavation adds another fragment to a story that remains incomplete, inviting future evidence to challenge or strengthen existing interpretations. That uncertainty is part of what makes studying deep human history so captivating. The questions remain alive. Whether the earliest mattress appeared first in southern Africa or somewhere else entirely may never be answered with complete confidence. What seems increasingly clear, however, is that prehistoric people did far more than simply collapse onto bare earth at the end of exhausting days. They observed, experimented, adapted, and quietly improved one of the most vulnerable hours of human existence. They transformed ordinary grass into technology not through machinery or invention as we usually define it, but through accumulated knowledge shaped by survival itself. Yet despite all these advances, one stubborn limitation remained impossible to ignore. Every carefully arranged mattress, no matter how soft, warm, or clean, still rested directly on the ground. Moisture could still creep upward after rain. Crawling insects could still reach sleeping bodies with ease. Snakes and small predators still moved across the same earth beneath those woven layers of grass. Humanity had discovered how to make the ground gentler, but it had not escaped the ground itself. The next breakthrough would require an even bolder idea, one so simple that today it feels almost obvious. Perhaps the safest place to sleep was not on the earth at all, but just above it. At some point in humanity's distant past, a surprisingly simple idea began to spread across different landscapes, separated by thousands of miles and countless generations. Instead of making the ground softer, perhaps the answer was to stop sleeping on the ground altogether. It sounds almost trivial today. A few inches hardly seem worth mentioning. Yet lifting a sleeping body, even the height of a hand, could change everything. Cold earth could no longer pull heat away as efficiently. Rainwater flowing across the ground might pass harmlessly underneath. Crawling insects would face a new obstacle. Small snakes, rodents, and other unwelcome nighttime visitors could no longer reach a sleeping person quite so easily. The invention was not dramatic enough to leave behind monuments or legends, but it quietly transformed one of the oldest human routines. Ironically, one of history's greatest improvements in everyday life may have begun with nothing more complicated than raising a bed a little higher than the dirt beneath it. Unlike stone tools or pottery, the earliest raised sleeping platforms almost certainly disappeared long ago. Wood rots, branches decay, plant fibers dissolve back into the soil. Archaeologists rarely uncover complete prehistoric beds because nature has had thousands of years to erase them. Instead, researchers piece together the story indirectly, drawing clues from preserved post holes, ancient house layouts, ethnographic comparisons, and the practical realities of living in different environments. The evidence does not point to a single inventor or one revolutionary civilization. Rather, it suggests that the idea of sleeping above the ground may have emerged independently in many places, each responding to similar challenges with remarkably similar solutions. That pattern appears again and again throughout human history. Separate societies facing comparable problems often arrive at comparable answers without ever meeting one another. Climate was almost certainly one of the strongest forces behind this shift. In tropical regions, the ground stays alive throughout the night. Moisture lingers, insects remain active, vegetation grows rapidly. Venomous animals may move silently through the darkness. Sleeping directly on the earth meant sharing the same surface with everything else that crawled, slithered, or hunted after sunset. Raising a sleeping platform even slightly could dramatically reduce some of those risks. It was never a perfect defense, but survival often depends on improving probabilities rather than eliminating danger entirely. Evolution rewards small advantages repeated over thousands of generations. A modest increase in warmth, fewer insect bites, or a reduced chance of encountering a snake while asleep could influence health far more than people at the time ever understood. Modern biology gives us another perspective our ancestors lacked. Many parasites spend portions of their life cycles close to the soil, waiting for opportunities to reach hosts. Fleas, ticks, mites, and countless biting insects thrive in environments where sleeping animals repeatedly return to the same place. Elevating a sleeping surface does not remove every parasite, but it changes the immediate environment in subtle ways. Air circulates more freely, moisture evaporates faster. Some insects face greater difficulty reaching resting bodies. None of these improvements would have been explained through science in prehistoric times. They would simply have been noticed through experience. Certain sleeping arrangements left people healthier, others did not. Knowledge accumulated quietly, one generation observing what seemed to work and passing those habits to the next. Elevated sleeping may also have emerged for reasons that had little to do with insects or predators. In many parts of the world, seasonal flooding transforms familiar landscapes overnight. Ground that feels perfectly dry before sunset can become saturated after heavy rain. Sleeping above the earth creates valuable separation from mud, standing water, and dampness. Even today, traditional homes in flood-prone regions across Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, and South America commonly stand on raised platforms or stilts. While many of these structures are relatively recent compared with deep prehistory, they reflect practical solutions to environmental challenges that humans have likely faced for tens of thousands of years. The exact architectural forms differ enormously, but the underlying principle remains strikingly consistent. Distance from the ground often increases safety. One fascinating aspect of this transition is how frequently it appears to have happened without complex technology. A raised sleeping place did not require nails, sawmills, or advanced carpentry. A few sturdy branches resting across stones, short logs supporting woven reeds, or simple wooden frames could accomplish the essential goal. In many traditional societies, documented by anthropologists, during the last 2 centuries, sleeping platforms were built using whatever materials the surrounding environment naturally provided. Bamboo, palm trunks, vines, bark strips, reeds, flexible saplings, and woven grasses all became building materials. These examples should not be viewed as unchanged relics from prehistoric life, since every culture continues to evolve over time, but they demonstrate how readily humans adapt local resources into practical sleeping structures without requiring highly specialized tools. As archaeologists compare settlements from different regions, another pattern begins to emerge. Raised sleeping surfaces often appear alongside broader changes in domestic organization. Once people invested effort into building more permanent shelters, the interior space itself acquired structure. Certain areas became associated with cooking, others with storage, others with sleeping. Although these divisions developed gradually and varied enormously across cultures, they hint at an important psychological shift. Sleep was no longer merely something that happened wherever exhaustion arrived. It increasingly occurred in a designated place, prepared specifically for rest. That idea seems obvious inside modern homes, yet it represented a profound transformation in how humans organized daily life. A sleeping place became part of the architecture, rather than simply part of the landscape. Curiously, not every raised sleeping platform was designed solely for nighttime. In some societies, elevated platforms served multiple purposes throughout the day. They became places to repair tools, prepare food, care for children, weave baskets, tell stories, or simply escape damp ground during rainy seasons. This reminds us that the earliest beds were probably less like today's bedroom furniture and more like versatile living spaces. The distinction between furniture and architecture may have been much less defined than it is now. A platform could support work during daylight and sleep after sunset without anyone viewing those activities as separate. Another possibility has intrigued researchers studying the evolution of disease. Ground-level living exposes people not only to insects, but also to animal waste, decaying organic matter, and microorganisms concentrated near the soil surface. Raising sleeping areas may have unintentionally reduced exposure to some environmental hazards. It would be impossible to measure these effects directly across prehistoric populations, and many variables remain impossible to reconstruct. Even so, the hypothesis reflects an important reality. People often discover useful behaviors long before understanding why those behaviors work. Humanity benefited from boiling water centuries before microbes were identified. Similarly, elevated sleeping may have provided health advantages that remained invisible until modern science offered explanations. Yet practical concerns were probably only part of the story. Human beings have always attached meaning to height. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, elevated places often acquired symbolic importance. Hills became sacred, mountains housed gods, Thrones stood above ordinary seating. Leaders occupied raised positions. Whether these associations influenced the earliest sleeping platforms remains impossible to determine, but the relationship between height and security seems deeply rooted in human psychology. Looking down over one's surroundings creates a subtle sense of control. Even sleeping just a short distance above the earth changes perspective. The ground becomes something beneath you rather than around you. That psychological shift may have reinforced practical advantages in ways archaeology cannot easily measure. There is another reason this innovation deserves attention. Unlike many prehistoric technologies, raising a sleeping platform did not depend on rare resources. Communities living in forests, wetlands, grasslands, river valleys, and coastal regions could all discover versions of the same solution using entirely different materials. This helps explain why historians hesitate to credit any single civilization with inventing the bed. The concept appears too broadly distributed and too intuitively useful. Independent invention seems entirely plausible. Similar environmental pressures often guide human creativity towards similar outcomes. The wheel emerged in some places, but not others, because suitable conditions varied dramatically. Elevated sleeping, by contrast, answered challenges that nearly every human community encountered sooner or later. Perhaps the most remarkable consequence of leaving the ground was not immediate survival, but the freedom it created for future innovation. Once a sleeping surface existed as a separate structure rather than part of the earth itself, people could begin improving the structure. Frames could become stronger, supports could become taller, surfaces could become wider, plant fibers could be woven tighter, animal hides could be stretched across wooden supports, cushions could be added later. In other words, lifting the bed transformed sleep into something humans could continuously redesign. The ground offers little opportunity for modification. A platform invites experimentation. Every generation could improve upon what the previous generation built. This gradual process eventually produced extraordinary diversity. Some cultures favored tightly woven plant fibers that remained cool in hot climates. Others preferred flexible wooden slats. Still others developed suspended hammocks, which likely emerged independently in parts of the Americas and later fascinated European explorers because they solved many familiar problems in entirely different ways. Although hammocks belong to a much later chapter in the broader history of sleep, they illustrate an enduring principle that first appeared with those earliest platforms. Once humans separated themselves from the earth, there was no longer a single correct way to sleep. Design became adaptable. Environment shaped invention. One community's perfect bed might perform terribly somewhere else. This diversity reminds us that there has never been one universal history of the bed, only many interconnected histories responding to different landscapes. Even after sleeping platforms became increasingly common in certain regions, the ground never disappeared completely from human life. Many people undoubtedly continued sleeping directly on prepared bedding for practical, cultural, or economic reasons. Some still do today. Human history rarely unfolds as a neat sequence in which one invention instantly replaces another. Old and new methods often coexist for centuries or even millennia. Raised platforms spread gradually where they offered clear advantages, while ground sleeping remained entirely sensible under other circumstances. This complexity makes the archaeological story richer, not simpler. There was no single moment when humanity collectively climbed off the earth forever. Instead, countless individuals, separated by time and geography, reached the same quiet conclusion. Sleeping above the ground simply worked better. That realization marked far more than an improvement in comfort. It represented one of the earliest examples of humans refusing to accept nature exactly as they found it. Instead of adapting themselves entirely to the landscape, they increasingly adapted the landscape to themselves. Yet these early platforms, ingenious as they were, remained humble creations built from local materials and practical necessity. They were designed for survival rather than status. That would eventually change. In one remarkable civilization, along the banks of the Nile, the place where you slept would become far more than protection from cold or insects. For the first time, a bed would begin telling the world exactly who you were. For tens of thousands of years, the place where people slept was defined almost entirely by necessity. A sleeping platform existed to keep its owner warmer, drier, cleaner, and safer than the ground below. Then something extraordinary happened along the fertile banks of the Nile. For perhaps the first time in recorded history, a bed began doing something far beyond protecting its owner through the night. It began telling a story. Before anyone spoke a word, before a visitor learned your name, before they knew your occupation or your family, they could look at your bed and immediately understand your place in society. In ancient Egypt, the bed quietly evolved into one of the earliest pieces of furniture that reflected wealth, power, craftsmanship, and even ideas about eternity. The transformation was so complete that some beds were considered valuable enough to accompany their owners into the afterlife. Egypt was uniquely positioned for this shift. Unlike highly mobile hunter-gatherer societies, Egyptian civilization flourished through long periods of relative stability, supported by the annual flooding of the Nile. Farming produced predictable harvests. Permanent settlements expanded into towns and cities. Skilled artisans specialized in woodworking, metalworking, weaving, and stone carving. When people no longer spent every season following food, they gained something equally valuable: time to improve the objects surrounding everyday life. Furniture became more sophisticated. Homes developed dedicated rooms. Daily routines settled into recognizable patterns. Sleep itself gradually became part of an ordered domestic world instead of simply another challenge of survival. The archaeological evidence is remarkably generous compared with many earlier periods. Egypt's dry climate preserved organic materials that would have disappeared almost everywhere else. Tombs sealed beneath desert sands protected furniture for thousands of years, allowing modern archaeologists to examine actual beds rather than relying entirely on indirect clues. Looking at these discoveries today creates an unusual feeling. Instead of imagining prehistoric sleeping places from microscopic plant fragments or decayed post holes, we can stand before real wooden bed frames built more than 3,000 years ago and recognize them instantly. They still resemble beds. The proportions feel familiar. 4 legs support a raised frame. A sleeping surface stretches between them. The concept is surprisingly modern, even though every detail reflects a civilization very different from our own. Among the most famous discoveries are the beds found inside the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter entered the largely intact burial chamber in 1922, he encountered an astonishing collection of furniture preserved beneath layers of history. Several ceremonial beds immediately captured attention. Some were shaped with elegant curves, while others rested upon carved animal legs, ending in carefully sculpted lion paws or the feet of sacred creatures. Gold gleamed across polished surfaces. Decorative inlays reflected extraordinary craftsmanship. These were not ordinary household objects. They were statements of royal identity. Yet even beyond their beauty, they revealed something equally fascinating. Egyptian carpenters had mastered techniques that combined strength, flexibility, and careful engineering long before many later civilizations developed comparable furniture traditions. Looking more closely at Egyptian beds reveals thoughtful design choices driven by both environment and experience. Many surviving examples feature slightly angled sleeping surfaces rather than perfectly flat ones. The head end often sits somewhat higher than the foot. Scholars have proposed several explanations. Elevating the upper body may have improved comfort, aided breathing, or reflected cultural preferences that evolved through long practice. None of these possibilities can be confirmed with complete certainty because written explanations remain scarce, but the repeated appearance of inclined beds suggests intentional design rather than accident. Sometimes, the simplest features invite the deepest questions. Why did Egyptian craftsmen repeatedly build beds this way? What practical advantages did they notice? We may never know exactly how they answered those questions themselves. The sleeping surface also differed from modern expectations. Instead of wooden slats or metal springs, many Egyptian beds supported sleepers using tightly woven strips of leather or plant fibers stretched across the frame. This flexible network created a surface that yielded gently beneath body weight while allowing airflow underneath. In Egypt's hot climate, ventilation mattered enormously. A raised woven surface permitted heat to dissipate more effectively than solid construction. Once again, necessity and comfort worked together. Luxury did not replace practical thinking, it refined it. Even the richest Egyptians still slept within the realities of desert temperatures and seasonal heat. Perhaps the most surprising object associated with Egyptian sleep is not the bed itself, but the pillow. To modern eyes, calling it a pillow almost feels misleading. Instead of soft feathers or stuffed fabric, many Egyptians rested their heads on carved headrests made from wood, stone, or ivory. These supports curved gently to cradle the neck while leaving the head elevated above the sleeping surface. At first glance, they appear profoundly uncomfortable. Modern visitors often wonder how anyone could possibly sleep using such an object. Yet appearances can be deceptive. Headrests prevented elaborate hairstyles and wigs from becoming flattened during sleep. They also promoted airflow around the head during warm nights. Some researchers have suggested they may have reduced contact with insects crawling across bedding, though the extent of that benefit remains difficult to verify. Practical reasons almost certainly combined with cultural traditions, creating an object that served purposes extending beyond simple softness. Religious symbolism added another layer. In Egyptian belief, the head possessed profound spiritual importance, and protecting it carried meaning beyond physical comfort. Decorative headrests sometimes included protective imagery associated with rebirth or divine guardianship. During burial, these objects accompanied the deceased into the tomb, suggesting they were expected to remain useful beyond earthly life. Here, the bed crossed another invisible boundary. It no longer belonged only to everyday existence. It became part of eternity itself. Sleep and death occupied closely connected places within Egyptian thought. Each sunset echoed a cycle of disappearance, followed by rebirth at dawn, much like the sun god Ra, journeying through the underworld before rising again. A bed could therefore become a place where earthly rest and cosmic belief quietly met. Of course, royal furniture represents only a tiny fraction of Egyptian society. Most people never slept on gilded frames or elaborately carved lion legs. Farmers, laborers, craftsmen, and servants lived far more modest lives. Their beds, when they owned dedicated bed frames at all, were usually built from simpler wood using straightforward construction techniques. Others likely relied on woven mats spread across raised platforms or directly on household floors. Archaeology naturally preserves elite objects more readily than ordinary possessions, creating an imbalance in what survives. It would be misleading to imagine every Egyptian household filled with luxurious furniture. Yet, even simpler beds reflected an important shift. Sleeping furniture had become a recognizable household object across much of society, rather than an occasional improvisation built from available materials. Furniture makers themselves occupied an increasingly specialized role. Egyptian woodworking demanded remarkable skill because high-quality timber was surprisingly scarce along the Nile. Native woods such as acacia and sycamore were available, but prized cedar arrived through trade, particularly from the forests of the eastern Mediterranean. Imported wood carried tremendous value. Craftsmen learned to maximize every piece, joining smaller sections with astonishing precision rather than relying on large, solid boards. Mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, leather lashings, and carefully fitted components created durable structures without modern fasteners. Many of these construction methods remained influential for thousands of years afterward. Examining Egyptian beds today often feels less like studying primitive furniture and more like admiring the work of experienced engineers disguised as artists. Wealth expressed itself through materials as much as design. Gold leaf, ebony, ivory, faience, colored glass, and precious stones transformed practical furniture into symbols of authority. Decorative carvings featured protective animals, sacred plants, or mythological imagery, reminding viewers that power extended beyond politics into religion itself. Owning such furniture announced status long before written records introduced titles or family histories. In that sense, the bed became a silent language. It communicated rank every day without requiring a single spoken word. This may represent one of the earliest moments when furniture evolved into a social statement as well as a functional object. Yet despite all this beauty, Egyptian beds never completely abandoned their original purpose. They remained elevated above the ground, preserving the practical advantages discovered long before civilization reached the Nile. Air still circulated underneath. The sleeping surface remained separated from insects, dampness, and dust accumulating along the floor. Practical design quietly survived beneath decorative elegance. Perhaps that balance explains why Egyptian beds appear surprisingly timeless. Remove the gold and symbolic carvings, and many underlying ideas still make sense today. Good design often outlives the culture that created it. There is another intriguing possibility worth considering. As beds became increasingly elaborate, they may also have reinforced emerging ideas about privacy. Earlier sleeping arrangements often involved entire families sharing common spaces. Permanent furniture naturally encouraged more predictable domestic organization. Although Egyptian homes varied enormously depending on wealth and location, designated sleeping furniture may have subtly shaped expectations about personal space, household routines, and family life. Archaeologists continue debating exactly how these social patterns evolved because surviving evidence remains incomplete, but the relationship between architecture, furniture, and behavior almost certainly influenced one another over time. The bed was not merely placed inside the home. It gradually helped define what the home itself became. Standing before an Egyptian bed in a museum today creates a curious emotional contrast. We recognize the object immediately because its purpose has barely changed across millennia. Yet every carved detail reminds us that the people who built it understood sleep through a world filled with gods, sacred cycles, elaborate rituals, and beliefs about life after death. Their beds belonged equally to daily existence and eternal destiny. Few civilizations fused those two worlds so completely through something as ordinary as a place to rest. But history rarely stands still for long. As Egyptian influence gradually faded and new powers rose across the Mediterranean, another civilization would inherit many practical ideas about elevated beds while taking them in an entirely different direction. For the Romans, the bed would become something even more versatile, not simply a place to sleep or display wealth, but a stage upon which much of everyday life itself unfolded. If the Egyptians transformed the bed into a symbol of rank, the Romans transformed it into something far more familiar. They made it part of everyday life in ways that still feel surprisingly modern. In Rome, a bed was no longer reserved only for sleeping, nor was it simply an object to display wealth. It became a place where people rested, recovered from illness, entertained guests, shared meals, read, thought, conducted business, and, in some cases, even died. It is difficult to find another civilization that blurred the line between furniture and daily life so completely. Looking inside a Roman home, you begin to realize that the bed was no longer just another piece of household equipment. It had quietly become one of the central stages upon which ordinary life unfolded. The Romans inherited ideas from many earlier cultures, including the Egyptians, Greeks, and peoples across the Mediterranean, but they rarely copied them exactly. Instead, they absorbed practical innovations, refined them, and adapted them to fit an expanding empire stretching across climates, landscapes, and cultures. The Roman approach to furniture reflected this same pattern. Beds became stronger, more standardized, and available in a wider variety of forms than ever before. Archaeological discoveries from cities such as Pompeii and Herculaneum, frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, provide one of the clearest windows into this evolution. While much of the wood has long since decayed, impressions in volcanic ash, surviving metal frames, bronze fittings, and preserved household layouts allow archaeologists to reconstruct Roman beds with remarkable confidence. Walking through the remains of Pompeii today, it becomes strikingly clear that bedrooms were no longer improvised corners of a dwelling. Many Roman houses included dedicated sleeping rooms, known as cubicula. These spaces were often modest in size, sometimes containing little more than a bed and a few storage items. Yet their very existence reveals something important. Sleep had become organized within domestic architecture in a way that reflected increasing privacy and routine. Not everyone enjoyed spacious sleeping quarters, of course. Wealth determined comfort then, just as it often does now. Yet even relatively modest homes frequently included designated places, intended primarily for rest. The idea that every activity deserved its own space was slowly taking shape. Roman beds themselves reveal an impressive understanding of practical design. Wooden frames remained common, though wealthier households sometimes owned beds, constructed partly from bronze or decorated with ivory, silver, or intricate carvings. The sleeping surface usually consisted of leather straps, ropes, or woven cords stretched tightly across the frame. These supported mattresses, stuffed with materials that varied enormously depending on a family's resources. Poorer households might rely on straw, reeds, or coarse plant fibers. Wealthier Romans often slept on mattresses filled with wool, feathers, or even soft down collected from waterfowl. Ancient writers occasionally mention luxurious fillings that sound surprisingly familiar today. While these mattresses lacked the layered engineering of modern designs, they represented a significant step toward prioritizing sustained physical comfort rather than merely surviving the night. Roman writers rarely describe mattresses with the excitement reserved for military victories or political speeches, yet scattered references suggest that people cared deeply about sleeping quality. The poet Martial, famous for his sharp observations about Roman society, occasionally mocked extravagance or luxury associated with household furnishings. Such remarks reveal an interesting truth. By the 1st century AD, people already recognized that some beds were noticeably more comfortable than others. Comfort itself had become something worth discussing, criticizing, envying, or purchasing. That cultural shift may seem subtle, but it marks an important departure from earlier eras when basic survival dominated nearly every sleeping decision. Perhaps the most surprising feature of Roman beds, at least from a modern perspective, is that many were never intended exclusively for sleep. One famous example is the lectus triclinaris, a dining couch used during formal meals. Wealthy Romans often reclined while eating, supporting themselves on one elbow as servants brought food through multiple courses. To modern eyes, this arrangement appears unusual, yet reclining while dining reflected both social convention and cultural identity. The object itself resembled a bed more than a chair, blurring distinctions that modern households carefully maintain. Elsewhere in the home, another type of bed, known as the lectus cubicularis, served more traditional sleeping purposes. Additional specialized couches existed for study, conversation, or ceremonial occasions. Rather than designing one universal piece of furniture, Roman society developed an entire family of related forms adapted to different aspects of life. This versatility says something profound about Roman attitudes toward rest. They did not sharply separate productivity from relaxation in the way many modern cultures often do, reading philosophy while reclining, discussing politics from a couch, recovering from illness in bed, or sharing conversations before sleep, all occupied overlapping spaces within domestic life. The bed became part of an environment where thinking, socializing, and resting naturally flowed into one another. Whether this encouraged healthier lifestyles is impossible to measure, but it certainly illustrates a broader understanding of furniture than simple nighttime use alone. Roman craftsmanship also reflected remarkable engineering skill. Bed frames frequently employed sophisticated joinery techniques refined through generations of woodworking tradition. Bronze fittings strengthened stress points, turned wooden legs, added both elegance and stability. Decorative details often featured animal motifs, mythological figures, or geometric patterns, reflecting prevailing artistic styles. Wealthier owners commissioned highly individualized pieces, while simpler examples remained practical and durable. The range reminds us once again that Roman society contained enormous economic diversity. Not every citizen experienced the luxury often associated with imperial Rome. Many lived in crowded apartment buildings, known as insulae, where space was extremely limited and furniture necessarily remained compact. Yet, even within these constraints, the raised bed itself had become a familiar expectation rather than a rare privilege. Hygiene likely played a larger role than is sometimes appreciated. Elevated beds continued offering advantages first discovered thousands of years earlier. Air circulated beneath sleeping surfaces, reducing moisture accumulation. Separation from dusty floors made sleeping environments somewhat cleaner. Insects and rodents faced greater obstacles reaching sleepers, although they certainly did not disappear entirely. Roman cities struggled with sanitation challenges, overcrowding, and periodic disease outbreaks. Beds could not eliminate these problems, but thoughtful household design helped mitigate some everyday discomforts. Once again, practical experience often anticipated scientific understanding by centuries. Another fascinating detail emerges from Roman literature and archaeology alike. Bedding itself became increasingly layered. Sheets, blankets, cushions, pillows, and decorative textiles all contributed to the sleeping environment. Wool dominated many household fabrics because of its warmth and availability throughout the empire, while linen offered cooler alternatives in warmer regions. Wealthy households sometimes imported luxurious textiles from distant provinces connected through Roman trade networks stretching across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. A person's bed therefore reflected not only local craftsmanship, but also the astonishing commercial reach of the empire itself. Materials gathered hundreds or even thousands of miles away could eventually become part of an ordinary night's sleep inside a Roman villa. Yet Roman comfort always existed alongside vulnerability. Despite remarkable engineering achievements, life expectancy remained low by modern standards. Disease spread easily. Medical knowledge remained limited. Political instability periodically disrupted even prosperous regions. Beds, therefore, acquired another important role. They became places where physicians examined patients, families gathered around the sick, and final conversations often took place. Ancient medical writers such as Galen discussed the importance of rest during illness, recognizing that recovery depended in part upon proper sleep, even though the biological mechanisms remained unknown. Here again, the bed quietly expanded beyond comfort into healthcare. Long before hospitals developed as specialized institutions, much healing occurred within the household itself. Roman attitudes towards sleep also reveal intriguing contradictions. Philosophers sometimes warned against excessive luxury, arguing that overly soft beds weakened discipline or moral character. Stoic thinkers, in particular, occasionally praised moderation and self-control, viewing hardship as beneficial for developing resilience. Meanwhile, wealthier Romans continued purchasing increasingly elaborate furnishings whenever possible. This tension between simplicity and luxury feels surprisingly familiar today. Modern debates about minimalism, comfort, consumerism, and well-being echo questions already circulating nearly 2,000 years ago. How much comfort is enough? At what point does convenience become excess? Ancient Rome never settled those questions completely, and perhaps no society ever has. There is another subtle innovation worth noticing. Roman beds became increasingly standardized in proportion and construction, allowing furniture makers to develop recognizable styles repeated across vast regions of the empire. While regional differences certainly remained, certain design principles spread widely through trade, military movement, and cultural exchange. In many ways, Rome accomplished for furniture what it achieved with roads, architecture, and engineering more broadly. It encouraged shared solutions across enormous geographic distances while still allowing local adaptation. A traveller moving from Britain to Syria might encounter different languages, climates, and foods, yet many aspects of household life would still feel surprisingly recognizable. That consistency represented one of Rome's greatest strengths. Looking back across this long progression, it becomes clear that Roman beds did not represent a single revolutionary invention. Instead, they embodied thousands of years of accumulated human experimentation. The raised platform, inherited from earlier societies, remained. Flexible sleeping surfaces continued evolving. Softer mattresses became more common. Dedicated sleeping rooms emerged alongside increasingly specialized furniture. Every improvement built quietly upon countless forgotten innovations, stretching back to prehistoric grass bedding laid across ancient cave floors. History rarely moves through sudden leaps. More often, it advances through generations, making ordinary things just a little better than before. Yet even Rome's remarkable achievements would not last forever. As the Western Roman Empire gradually fragmented under political upheaval, economic decline, and repeated invasions, many systems supporting everyday comfort began changing as well. Grand villas fell into ruin. Trade routes weakened. Skilled craftsmanship became less centralized in many regions. Beds survived, of course, but the world surrounding them was entering an era where warmth, protection, and security would once again become urgent priorities. In the colder stone houses of medieval Europe, the bed would undergo another remarkable transformation, not to display imperial sophistication, but to defend its sleeper against an entirely different enemy, the freezing night itself. If you walked into the bedroom of a wealthy medieval household without knowing what you were looking at, you might mistake the bed for a small wooden room built inside a larger one. Heavy posts rose toward the ceiling. Thick curtains surrounded every side. A carved canopy stretched overhead like a roof. Once the curtains were closed, the sleeper almost disappeared inside a private chamber no larger than the bed itself. To modern eyes, it seems extravagant, almost theatrical, as though medieval craftsmen had turned an ordinary piece of furniture into miniature architecture. Yet beneath all of that carved oak and embroidered fabric lay a surprisingly practical idea. These beds were not built to impress first. They were built to survive the cold. In many parts of medieval Europe, comfort meant something very different from what it means today. A soft mattress certainly mattered, but warmth often mattered far more. Imagine spending a winter night inside a stone castle. Modern movies usually portray castles as grand and luxurious, yet anyone who has visited one during the colder months quickly discovers another reality. Thick stone walls absorb cold extraordinarily well. Large rooms are difficult to heat evenly. Glass windows, when they existed at all, were small, expensive, and often poorly insulated. Drafts slipped through tiny cracks around doors, shutters, and roof beams. Even fireplaces, while essential, rarely warmed an entire building. Most of the heat escaped upward through chimneys, leaving sleeping chambers surprisingly chilly long after the fire had burned low. Under those conditions, the bed itself became a kind of climate control system centuries before central heating existed. The famous canopy bed was one answer to this challenge. Contrary to popular myths, the canopy was not primarily invented to stop insects or protect sleepers from debris falling through roofs, although those ideas are frequently repeated today. Historians generally agree that its most important function was helping retain warmth and providing a sense of enclosure. Heavy curtains trapped body heat inside a relatively small space surrounding the sleeper. Instead of attempting the impossible task of heating an entire room, medieval households concentrated warmth where it mattered most. In effect, the bed became a room within a room. It was an elegantly simple solution based on observation rather than technology. Even a slight reduction in moving air could make long winter nights significantly more bearable. This design spread gradually across Europe, especially among wealthier households, able to afford the large quantities of wood, fabric, and skilled craftsmanship required. Massive oak frames supported thick woven curtains made from wool, linen, or, for the very wealthy, imported silks and richly decorated textiles. Embroidery transformed practical insulation into displays of prestige. Gold thread, heraldic symbols, religious imagery, and elaborate floral designs decorated fabrics that served both functional and symbolic purposes. Once again, the history of the bed reveals a familiar pattern. An innovation born from necessity gradually became an opportunity for artistic expression and social distinction. Yet unlike the royal beds of ancient Egypt, medieval canopy beds rarely abandoned their practical origins. Even the finest examples still worked remarkably well at conserving warmth. The bed's height also deserves attention. Medieval beds often stood noticeably higher above the floor than many modern beds. Some required small stools or steps to climb into comfortably. While impressive appearance certainly played a role, there were practical reasons as well. Cold air naturally settles closer to the floor. Raising the sleeping surface placed the sleeper slightly farther from the coldest layer of air inside the room. Elevated frames also helped reduce exposure to drafts, dirt, rodents, and dampness accumulating near ground level. Once again, centuries of accumulated experience quietly shaped design decisions long before anyone understood the physics involved. Looking beneath these impressive structures reveals another layer of ingenuity. Mattress construction continued evolving during the Middle Ages. Wealthier households increasingly used stuffed mattresses filled with wool, feathers, horsehair, or combinations of natural fibers. Poorer families often relied on straw-filled mattresses, known in later centuries as palliaces. Straw compressed over time and required periodic replacement, but it remained inexpensive and widely available. Even within the same society, sleep quality varied enormously depending upon wealth, occupation, and geography. Medieval Europe contained extraordinary contrasts. Noble families slept beneath embroidered canopies, while many peasants continued resting on simple straw pallets laid across wooden frames or directly upon earthen floors. Yet the underlying idea remained surprisingly consistent. Nearly everyone sought some form of insulation separating body from ground, preserving a principle first explored tens of thousands of years earlier through layers of prehistoric grass. The bedroom itself also changed during this period. In earlier centuries, sleeping often occurred in multi-purpose spaces shared by extended families, servants, travelers, and guests. Medieval households, particularly among the upper classes, gradually developed more specialized domestic arrangements. Private chambers became increasingly important for wealthy families, though privacy itself remained very different from modern expectations. Even nobles rarely enjoyed complete solitude. Servants frequently slept nearby, attended to nighttime needs, or remained available should emergencies arise. Personal space existed, but it was shaped by social hierarchy rather than individual preference. The bed occupied the center of this evolving domestic world. It became not only the warmest place in the room, but often its most valuable object. Inventories, recorded after the deaths of wealthy medieval individuals, frequently listed beds among the most expensive possessions they owned. In some cases, a magnificent bed cost more than many other household furnishings combined. Timber itself represented significant value. Skilled carpenters invested hundreds of hours carving intricate posts, headboards, and decorative panels. Fine textiles demanded equally specialized labor. Every curtain, blanket, embroidered coverlet, and canopy reflected thousands of hours of spinning, weaving, dyeing, and stitching. A completed bed represented the combined work of numerous craftspeople. It was both furniture and investment. Families sometimes passed important beds from one generation to the next, much as they did land, jewelry, or silver. The symbolism surrounding beds also grew increasingly rich. Royal births, political negotiations, weddings, illnesses, and final farewells often took place in or around them. Some monarchs even held formal audiences while seated in bed during periods of illness or ceremonial occasions. The bed had become a stage for public life as much as private rest. This may seem strange today, yet it reflects a society where household space remained far more fluid than modern homes. Important events unfolded wherever appropriate furniture and social custom allowed. Beds occupied positions of remarkable visibility within elite culture. At the same time, everyday medieval families often slept together in ways that surprise modern audiences. Historical records, legal documents, household accounts, and literary descriptions all suggest that bed sharing was extremely common. Husbands and wives naturally shared beds, but so did siblings, servants, apprentices, travelers, children, and sometimes even unrelated adults, depending on circumstance. Inns routinely assigned strangers to the same bed when accommodations were limited. This practice reflected practicality rather than intimacy. Beds were expensive, heated rooms were scarce, and sharing body warmth significantly improved survival during cold weather. Modern expectations of personal sleeping space would have seemed luxurious to many medieval households. Warmth was a resource, and people conserved it collectively whenever necessary. The curtains surrounding canopy beds reinforced this idea beautifully. Once drawn closed, they trapped not only warm air, but also the combined body heat of everyone sleeping inside. Large family beds sometimes accommodated multiple generations simultaneously. While such arrangements varied enormously across regions, social classes, and centuries, they remind us that sleep remained deeply communal throughout much of medieval history. The private bedroom occupied by a single individual is, historically speaking, a relatively recent development. Another overlooked feature of medieval beds involves sound. Thick curtains softened echoes inside large stone chambers, while reducing drafts that carried noise through open spaces. Although complete silence was impossible, enclosed beds created quieter sleeping environments compared with exposed rooms filled with servants, animals, crackling fires, and constant household activity. Once again, a practical solution produced multiple benefits. Warmth, privacy, darkness, and reduced noise combined within the same architectural design. The medieval bed functioned almost like an insulated sleeping capsule centuries before anyone imagined modern bedrooms. Of course, not every historian agrees on exactly how widespread, elaborate canopy beds became outside noble households. Surviving examples overwhelmingly represent wealthier owners because expensive furniture is more likely to be preserved, documented, and collected. Simpler wooden beds, made from inexpensive materials, rarely survive intact across hundreds of years. This creates an unavoidable bias in the archaeological record. Even so, written inventories, wills, paintings, and surviving household accounts suggest that the general principle of raised wooden beds spread broadly, while elaborate canopies remained concentrated among wealthier segments of society. Like many technological improvements, the idea diffused gradually rather than appearing everywhere at once. Medieval medicine added another intriguing dimension. Physicians often recommended bed rest for illness, balancing bodily humors through warmth, diet, and controlled environments according to prevailing medical theories. Although humoral medicine differs greatly from modern science, the emphasis on warmth and recovery inside bedchambers reflected genuine observation. People recovering from injury or disease often improved when protected from cold, exhaustion, and exposure. The explanations were imperfect, but many practical recommendations aligned surprisingly well with outcomes recognized today. Beds increasingly became places associated with healing as well as sleeping. Looking across this period as a whole, one realization becomes difficult to ignore. Medieval people did not simply build larger beds because they admired impressive furniture. They built protective environments around the sleeper. The bed evolved into a carefully engineered shelter, responding to climate, architecture, economics, family life, and social customs all at once. It was almost a second house placed inside the first, proving once again that the history of the bed has rarely been driven by comfort alone. Survival remained the silent architect behind nearly every improvement. Yet while medieval craftsmen perfected the structure surrounding the sleeper, another quiet transformation was taking place inside the bed itself. Pillows became softer, blankets warmer, fabrics finer, and mattresses increasingly sophisticated. The next chapter of this story would no longer focus primarily on the frame. Instead, it would explore the hidden inventions lying directly beneath every sleeping body, objects so ordinary today that we rarely stop to wonder when they first appeared, or how profoundly they changed the simple act of closing our eyes at night. By the late Middle Ages, the bed itself had become an impressive structure. Thick wooden frames, carved posts, and heavy curtains had turned sleeping into something far more sheltered than it had ever been before. Yet, if you removed everything resting on top of that frame, something surprising would become clear. A bed without its bedding is little more than a platform. What truly determines whether a night's sleep feels warm, soft, or restorative is not the wood beneath you, but the layers surrounding your body. Pillows cradle your head. Blankets hold your warmth. Sheets separate your skin from the mattress. These objects seem so ordinary that most of us never stop to wonder where they came from. Yet each has its own remarkable history, stretching across thousands of years, shaped not by fashion alone but by climate, technology, trade, and humanity's endless search for better sleep. Among them all, perhaps the pillow has undergone the most dramatic transformation. If someone from the 21st century were transported into many ancient civilizations, the pillow would probably be the first bedtime object to cause genuine confusion. Instead of something soft and inviting, they might be handed a carefully carved block of wood, a curved piece of polished stone, or a ceramic headrest shaped to support only the neck. It would seem almost impossible to sleep comfortably on such an object. Yet comfort is always defined by culture as much as by biology. Ancient Egyptians, as we have already seen, commonly used rigid headrests that protected elaborate hairstyles, encouraged airflow, and may have reduced contact between the head and insects crawling across bedding. Similar objects appeared in parts of ancient China, Japan, Korea, and other regions of East Asia, although their designs and cultural meanings differed considerably. Ceramic pillows from later Chinese dynasties, for example, sometimes featured beautifully painted surfaces and intricate craftsmanship. Some scholars have suggested that their cool surfaces were appreciated during warm seasons, while others note symbolic or artistic values beyond simple practicality. Whatever the precise reasons, one conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. For much of human history, supporting the head did not necessarily require softness. That expectation emerged surprisingly late. Soft pillows gradually became more common as textile production improved and filling materials became easier to obtain. Wool, feathers, down, cotton fibers, flax, horsehair, and plant materials all found their way inside pillowcases, depending on local resources and economic circumstances. Feather pillows eventually became especially prized because they compressed gently beneath the head while maintaining volume. Collecting enough feathers, however, required considerable labor. For ordinary families, straw or coarse fibers often remained the practical choice. Once again, sleep reflected social inequality. The difference between resting on goose down and resting on bundled straw could be felt every single night. Blankets tell an equally fascinating story. Long before woven textiles became widespread, animal hides almost certainly served as humanity's earliest nighttime coverings. They offered insulation, durability, and availability wherever hunting formed part of daily life. Yet hides also came with disadvantages. They could become stiff after drying, retained odors if not carefully prepared, and varied greatly depending on the species from which they came. As weaving technologies advanced, woven fabrics gradually replaced skins in many regions, though both continued to coexist for centuries. Wool became one of history's greatest sleeping materials. Sheep transformed coarse grasses that humans could not digest into warm, flexible fibers capable of trapping countless tiny pockets of insulating air. Even when slightly damp, wool retained much of its insulating ability, making it particularly valuable in cool or unpredictable climates. It is difficult to overstate wool's importance in the history of sleep. Entire economies grew around sheep, wool production, spinning, weaving, and textile trade. Medieval Europe, for example, became deeply connected through the wool industry, influencing not only clothing, but also bedding inside countless homes. Linen followed a different path. Produced from the fibers of the flax plant, linen offered qualities almost opposite to wool. It remained cool against the skin, absorbed moisture effectively, and dried relatively quickly. In warmer climates, these characteristics made it exceptionally desirable. Ancient Egypt produced fine linen centuries before many neighboring societies mastered comparable textile techniques. Linen sheets eventually spread across much of Europe, becoming symbols of cleanliness and refinement. Interestingly, the word bed linens still preserves that long historical association, even though many modern sheets contain little or no flax at all. Cotton arrived more gradually in many parts of Europe, though it had been cultivated for thousands of years elsewhere, particularly in South Asia and later across the Islamic world. As trade networks expanded, cotton fabrics slowly gained popularity because they combined softness, breathability, and ease of washing. By the early modern period, cotton would begin reshaping household textiles on a massive scale, although its widespread dominance required later industrial developments beyond the medieval world. The story reminds us that sleep has always depended upon global connections as much as local craftsmanship. Materials harvested in one region often transformed bedtime routines thousands of miles away. Then there are sheets themselves, perhaps the most overlooked layer in every bed. At first glance, a sheet seems almost unnecessary. After all, why place another piece of fabric between your body and the mattress? Yet sheets solved several practical problems simultaneously. They protected expensive mattresses from sweat, skin oils, dirt, and everyday wear. Washing a sheet required far less effort than replacing an entire mattress. In an era before synthetic materials and modern cleaning methods, this distinction mattered enormously. Mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool, or straw were difficult to clean thoroughly. Removable sheets extended their lifespan while creating a fresher sleeping surface. Hygiene, though understood differently than today, quietly shaped bedding long before modern germ theory existed. The preference for white bed linens also has surprisingly practical origins. Today, white sheets often symbolize hotels, luxury, or simplicity, but historically, they served another important purpose. White fabric made stains, dirt, insects, and signs of wear easier to detect. Before chemical dyes became inexpensive and color-fast, maintaining bright white linens required careful washing, bleaching, and exposure to sunlight. Clean white bedding therefore became both evidence of hygiene and a subtle display of household diligence or wealth. Some historians argue that white linens gradually acquired social prestige, precisely because keeping them clean demanded significant labor. The color itself became a visible advertisement of order. Another quiet revolution occurred inside the mattress. Earlier straw-filled mattresses remained common for centuries, but wealthier households increasingly experimented with softer fillings. Feathers offered luxurious cushioning, but required regular shaking and redistribution to prevent clumping. Wool compressed more slowly, while providing reliable insulation. Horsehair, surprisingly, became another respected filling because of its durability and resilience. Rather than collapsing permanently under weight, horsehair tended to spring back into shape more effectively than many plant fibers. Every material involved compromises among cost, comfort, durability, and availability. There has never been one perfect mattress filling, only solutions optimized for different circumstances. Regional variation remained astonishingly diverse. In colder northern climates, thick wool blankets dominated many households. Around the Mediterranean, lighter woven coverings often proved more practical. Across Central Asia, felt made from compressed wool insulated against harsh continental winters. In parts of East Asia, silk quilts became highly valued among wealthy families because silk combined lightness with remarkable insulating properties. Indigenous communities throughout the Americas developed bedding traditions using local plant fibers, woven textiles, feathers, and animal skins adapted to regional conditions. There was no universal formula for sleeping well. Geography continued shaping bedtime more powerfully than fashion. One of the most intriguing aspects of bedding history is how often invisible knowledge mattered more than visible objects. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, tanning hides, washing fabrics, collecting feathers, carding wool, stuffing mattresses, sewing seams, and repairing worn textiles required generations of accumulated expertise. Most of this work occurred quietly inside households or local workshops. Unlike monumental architecture or military victories, these skills rarely appeared in official histories, yet they transformed everyday life just as profoundly. Millions of people slept better because countless anonymous craftspeople gradually refined materials that most chroniclers considered too ordinary to mention. Sometimes, history's greatest innovations leave the smallest footprints. The rise of layered bedding also changed how people thought about seasonal living. Instead of relying on one universal sleeping arrangement throughout the year, households increasingly adjusted bedding according to weather. Heavy blankets emerged during winter. Lighter covers replaced them in summer. Additional quilts could be added during unusually cold nights. Bedding became adaptable, allowing families to respond to changing climates without rebuilding furniture itself. This flexibility represented another subtle technological advance. The bed frame remained relatively constant, while its surrounding layers evolved with the seasons. Cultural beliefs also found their way into bedding. Embroidered quilts sometimes carried protective symbols. Wedding linens became treasured heirlooms passed between generations. Mothers stitched blankets for newborn children. Families preserved special coverlets for important occasions. Throughout Europe and many other parts of the world, bedding accumulated emotional value alongside practical use. It witnessed births, illnesses, celebrations, reconciliations, and final farewells. A blanket could become a memory. A pillow might remain in a family for decades. These objects absorbed human stories as quietly as they absorbed warmth. Modern sleep science unexpectedly validates some ancient instincts while overturning others. We now understand that breathable fabrics help regulate body temperature, an important factor influencing sleep quality. Materials capable of managing moisture reduce discomfort during the night. Clean bedding limits exposure to allergens, dust mites, and certain skin irritants. At the same time, other historical beliefs, such as assigning magical protective powers to particular textiles or fillings, belong more to cultural tradition than scientific evidence. Yet it would be unfair to dismiss earlier generations as merely superstitious. They often reached practical conclusions through observation, even when their explanations reflected the beliefs of their time. History repeatedly reminds us that useful knowledge does not always begin with complete understanding. Looking across thousands of years, it becomes surprisingly difficult to identify the single most important invention in bedding. Was it the pillow that supported the neck? The blanket that trapped warmth? The sheet that protected hygiene? The feather mattress that eased pressure on tired muscles? None of these innovations worked alone. Together, they transformed a wooden frame into something capable of supporting genuine rest. By the time these layers came together, the bed had become far more than furniture. It had become a carefully engineered environment built from centuries of experimentation with fibers, feathers, hides, plants, and cloth. Yet for all these remarkable improvements, there was still one truth that no blanket, pillow, or sheet could change. Every culture on Earth continued shaping sleep according to its own landscape. A bed that felt perfect inside a medieval European castle might have been unbearably hot in a tropical rainforest or utterly impractical on the frozen Arctic tundra. The next chapter reveals perhaps the greatest surprise in the history of sleep. Humanity never invented one ideal bed. Instead, different civilizations created entirely different answers to the same timeless question: how do we rest safely through the night? If there is one lesson hidden inside the history of the bed, it is that there has never been a single perfect way to sleep. We often imagine progress as a straight line, with each generation discovering a better solution until everyone eventually arrives at the same destination. But sleep tells a very different story. Travel across the ancient world, and the bed changes almost as dramatically as the landscape itself. In one region, people sleep close to the floor. In another, they climb onto raised wooden platforms. Somewhere else, they sway gently above the ground in woven hammocks. Some rest beneath thick wool blankets. Others sleep under little more than a light cloth, despite owning finely crafted homes. These differences were not accidents of culture alone. More often than not, they reflected something even more powerful. Climate quietly became the architect of bedtime. Geography decided what comfort meant long before personal preference ever could. Consider Japan, where one of the world's most distinctive sleeping traditions gradually developed. Instead of building permanently elevated beds that dominated the room, many Japanese households came to rely on bedding that could be unfolded each evening and stored away during the day. The modern futon is the best-known example, although its exact form emerged relatively late compared with earlier sleeping arrangements. Before that, people slept on layers placed over tatami mats woven from soft rush grass. These floors provided slight cushioning, natural insulation, and excellent breathability. Because much of Japan experiences humid summers and significant seasonal changes, lifting and airing bedding became an important part of maintaining cleanliness. Rather than treating the bedroom as a permanently dedicated space, rooms could serve multiple purposes throughout the day before transforming into sleeping areas at night. It was an elegant solution to limited interior space, but it also reflected generations of adaptation to local climate. In many ways, Japanese sleeping traditions remind us that a bed does not always need legs to be sophisticated. Move westward into ancient China, and an entirely different philosophy begins to appear. Depending on the dynasty, region, and household, sleeping furniture varied considerably, making sweeping generalizations difficult. Yet, archaeological discoveries and historical records suggest that raised wooden beds became common among wealthier families, often accompanied by elaborate wooden frames and decorative screens. During colder periods, another remarkable innovation appeared in northern China: heated sleeping platforms known as kangs. These masonry structures, warmed by channels carrying heat from nearby stoves or fireplaces, allowed families to sleep above a surface that remained gently warm through freezing winters. The concept was astonishingly practical. Instead of trying to heat large interior spaces continuously, heat was concentrated exactly where people rested. Variations of the kang survived for centuries because they responded perfectly to the realities of northern climates. It serves as another reminder that true innovation often emerges from environmental necessity rather than technological ambition. Further south, where heat and humidity dominated daily life, elevated wooden platforms encouraged airflow beneath the sleeper, reducing dampness and improving comfort. Once again, local conditions quietly shaped design. Across Southeast Asia, similar principles appeared in remarkably diverse forms. In many traditional communities, houses stood on stilts above the ground, protecting families from seasonal flooding, insects, snakes, and moisture. Naturally, sleeping spaces rose with the house itself. Bamboo became one of the region's greatest building materials. Strong, lightweight, flexible, and abundant, it formed beds that allowed air to circulate freely beneath both the structure and the sleeper. Bamboo surfaces rarely resembled the thick upholstered mattresses familiar today, yet in tropical climates they offered distinct advantages. Breathability often mattered more than softness. A mattress that trapped heat could become deeply uncomfortable during warm nights. Here again, comfort was defined by local reality rather than universal standards. Across the Pacific, entirely different solutions emerged. Long before European arrival, many indigenous peoples of the Americas developed sophisticated sleeping traditions suited to remarkably diverse environments. In tropical regions, stretching from parts of Central America into northern South America and the Caribbean, the hammock became one of humanity's most ingenious sleeping inventions. Woven from plant fibers, suspended above the ground, and gently flexible beneath the body, hammocks solved several problems simultaneously. They improved airflow during humid nights, reduced contact with insects and small animals, adapted easily to uneven terrain, and could be transported when communities moved. When Christopher Columbus and later European explorers first encountered hammocks, they were impressed enough to adopt them aboard ships, where swinging motion actually proved advantageous on rolling seas. Today, the hammock often symbolizes leisure, yet its origins reflect careful environmental adaptation rather than relaxation alone. It is one of history's clearest examples of a bed perfectly matched to its surroundings. Not every civilization sought elevation. Among the Maya, for example, evidence suggests that sleeping arrangements varied depending on social status, available materials, and household structure. Some families likely slept on woven mats spread across prepared platforms, while elites enjoyed more elaborate wooden furniture. Archaeological remains from residential compounds indicate that sleeping, cooking, and daily life often occurred within flexible domestic spaces, rather than rigidly separated rooms. Once again, the idea of a universal bedroom fades away. Ancient homes frequently adapted according to immediate needs, instead of following fixed architectural rules. Far to the north, another challenge awaited. For the Inuit and other Arctic peoples, surviving the night required confronting temperatures capable of killing within hours. Here, softness became secondary to insulation. Animal skins, especially caribou, hides with their exceptional insulating properties, form the foundation of sleeping systems refined over countless generations. Layers trapped warm air while minimizing heat loss to frozen ground. Snow houses, often misunderstood in popular imagination, actually functioned as surprisingly effective insulators because compacted snow contains countless air pockets that slow heat transfer. Inside these shelters, carefully arranged bedding transformed an otherwise lethal environment into one where families could survive long polar nights. It is difficult to imagine a stronger example of climate dictating the design of sleep. Meanwhile, across the vast Eurasian steppes, nomadic communities such as the early pastoral peoples developed sleeping traditions suited to constant movement. Permanent wooden beds made little sense when homes themselves traveled seasonally. Portable bedding, felt mats, wool blankets, and collapsible furnishings became far more practical. Felt, created by compressing wool fibers through moisture, heat, and pressure, provided extraordinary insulation while remaining relatively lightweight and durable. Inside circular tents, known in later centuries as yurts or gers, carefully layered bedding transformed temporary shelters into surprisingly comfortable homes. Once again, mobility, rather than permanence, determined design. A heavy carved bed would have represented not luxury, but inconvenience. Africa presents perhaps the greatest diversity of sleeping traditions because its climates range from Mediterranean coastlines to deserts, rainforests, mountains, and open savannas. It would be misleading to speak of one ancient African bed. Instead, countless regional solutions evolved independently. In some communities, woven mats remained common because they could be rolled, transported, cleaned, and replaced easily. Elsewhere, raised wooden platforms protected sleepers from insects and damp ground. Certain groups incorporated animal hides, woven reeds, or carefully prepared grasses, depending on available resources. Archaeological evidence remains uneven because organic materials rarely survive equally well across different environments, leaving many traditions known primarily through later ethnographic observations and historical accounts rather than direct excavation. This incomplete record reminds us once again that history often preserves stone while forgetting fiber, wood, and cloth. Even within Europe, Sleeping practices varied far more than modern assumptions suggest. Wealthy medieval households slept beneath elaborate canopy beds, while many rural families continued using straw mattresses laid upon simple wooden frames or directly atop raised platforms. Mountain communities, coastal villages, monasteries, castles, and farming settlements all developed bedding suited to local climates and economic realities. There was never one European way to sleep, any more than there was one Asian or American way. Regional adaptation remained the rule almost everywhere. Looking across these diverse traditions reveals an important pattern. Similar environmental problems repeatedly produced similar solutions, even among societies separated by oceans and thousands of years of independent development. Humid climates favored airflow, cold climates emphasized insulation, flood-prone regions elevated sleeping surfaces, mobile communities valued portability, dense forests encouraged locally available materials, open grasslands inspired others. Human creativity repeatedly followed the quiet guidance of geography. This observation carries an interesting implication. When archaeologists discover similar sleeping structures in distant parts of the world, it does not necessarily mean one culture borrowed directly from another. Independent invention often provides an equally plausible explanation. The needs were similar, the landscapes were similar, similar ideas naturally followed. Sleep may therefore represent one of humanity's most universal examples of convergent innovation. There is another subtle lesson hidden here. Modern people often assume that the highest form of technology is the most complex one, yet many traditional sleeping systems remain astonishingly effective, precisely because they fit their environments so perfectly. A thick spring mattress placed inside a humid tropical hut might become unbearably hot. A woven bamboo platform that appears simple by comparison could produce a far better night's sleep. Likewise, an Arctic family would gain little from lightweight tropical bedding, while heavy, insulated hides that seem primitive elsewhere become life-saving technologies in freezing conditions. Good design has never been about complexity alone. It has always been about solving the right problem. Throughout history, travelers frequently misunderstood these differences. European explorers sometimes described unfamiliar sleeping customs as backward, simply because they differed from European norms. Yet many later observers discovered that local solutions often worked exceptionally well once environmental conditions were understood. The hammock, the heated kang, bamboo platforms, felt bedding, tatami floors, and woven reed mats all reveal the same quiet truth. Human beings were not searching for one perfect bed. They were searching for the perfect bed for where they happened to live. Perhaps that realization changes the way we think about progress itself. Instead of imagining civilization as a competition producing one ultimate design, the history of sleep suggests something far more elegant. Different cultures solved the same biological challenge in different but equally intelligent ways. Climate, available materials, architecture, mobility, and tradition all became partners in shaping bedtime. The result was not one history of the bed, but hundreds of parallel histories unfolding across the planet. Yet, despite this extraordinary diversity, every civilization still shared one mystery that no amount of craftsmanship could answer. Why do humans spend nearly 1/3 of their lives asleep in the first place? Long before modern neuroscience offered its theories, ancient physicians, philosophers, priests, and healers all struggled with that same question. Their answers would shape ideas about health, dreams, consciousness, and the human body for centuries to come, revealing that the greatest mystery was never the bed itself, but the sleeping mind lying upon it. After thousands of years spent improving where humans slept, another question slowly began to emerge. Perhaps the greatest mystery was never the bed itself, but what happened once someone closed their eyes. Every civilization had watched the same strange transformation unfold countless times. A person who had been speaking only moments before suddenly became silent. Their breathing slowed, their muscles relaxed, their eyes moved beneath closed eyelids. Hours later, they awoke, sometimes refreshed, sometimes exhausted, sometimes convinced they had visited places that existed nowhere in the waking world. Sleep was universal, yet almost nothing about it seemed obvious. Long before laboratories, brain scans, or neuroscience, people searched for explanations using the best tools available to them: careful observation, philosophy, religion, and experience. Many of their conclusions were incorrect by modern scientific standards. Others proved surprisingly insightful. Together they form one of history's most fascinating attempts to understand the human mind without ever seeing inside it. Among the earliest systematic thinkers were the physicians of ancient Greece. Unlike many earlier traditions that explained illness primarily through supernatural causes, Greek medicine increasingly emphasized observation of the natural world. Perhaps no name is more closely associated with this shift than Hippocrates, whose writings and the works attributed to his school encouraged physicians to study patterns rather than relying entirely on divine intervention. Sleep occupied an important place within this emerging medical philosophy. It was viewed not simply as rest, but as part of the body's natural balance. According to the prevailing theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, health depended upon maintaining equilibrium among these internal substances. While modern medicine has long abandoned humoral theory, it represented one of the earliest attempts to explain bodily function through consistent natural principles rather than unpredictable supernatural forces. Within that framework, both too much sleep and too little sleep could signal imbalance. Interestingly, this idea does not sound entirely foreign today. Modern medicine likewise recognizes that both chronic sleep deprivation and excessive sleeping may sometimes accompany underlying health problems, even though the biological explanations differ completely. Several centuries later, the physician Galen expanded upon many Hippocratic ideas while adding his own observations. His influence became so enormous that parts of Europe and the Middle East continued studying his medical writings for more than 1,000 years. Galen believed sleep allowed digestion, growth, and bodily restoration to occur more effectively because vital processes could concentrate inward while external activity diminished. His understanding of anatomy differed greatly from modern neuroscience, yet some of his broader observations feel unexpectedly familiar. Today we know that sleep contributes to tissue repair, immune function, memory consolidation, hormone regulation, and countless other biological processes. Galen could not possibly have understood these mechanisms, but he recognized that sleep served purposes extending far beyond simple inactivity. Experience had led him toward conclusions that science would only partially explain many centuries later. Dreams posed an even greater puzzle. Ancient Greek thinkers rarely agreed completely about what dreams represented. Some regarded them as messages from the gods. Others interpreted them as reflections of bodily health or emotional states. Aristotle offered one of the more naturalistic approaches, arguing that dreams arose from sensory impressions lingering inside the mind after waking experience. He rejected many supernatural interpretations, while acknowledging that dreams could occasionally seem meaningful because the sleeping mind continued processing internal sensations. Although Aristotle's explanation falls short of modern neuroscience, his willingness to search for ordinary, rather than miraculous causes, marked an important intellectual shift. He suspected that dreams originated within the sleeper rather than arriving from outside forces. That possibility still echoes through contemporary research. Yet dreams remain difficult to explain because they often felt astonishingly real. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, India, and countless other civilizations, dream interpretation became woven into religious and cultural life. Ancient Egyptian dream manuals listed symbols believed to predict future events. Mesopotamian rulers sometimes consulted dreams before making political or military decisions. In the Hebrew Bible, dreams frequently carried divine messages, shaping the course of history. Similar traditions appeared independently across much of the ancient world. Whether dreams truly revealed hidden truths remained impossible to verify, but their emotional power made them impossible to ignore. Even today, despite remarkable advances in neuroscience, dreams continue resisting complete explanation. Scientists understand far more about the physiology of dreaming than ancient observers ever could, yet many fundamental questions remain open. Why certain dreams feel intensely memorable, while others vanish within seconds, remains an active area of research. Sleep itself also became deeply connected to morality, spirituality, and daily discipline. Greek philosophers often encouraged moderation, viewing excessive sleep as a sign of weakened self-control. Roman writers sometimes echoed similar concerns, praising balanced habits over indulgence. Elsewhere, religious traditions incorporated nighttime prayer, meditation, or ritual purification before sleep. These practices varied enormously across cultures, yet they reveal a shared intuition that how one approached sleep reflected broader ideas about living well. Sleep was never merely biological. It occupied ethical and spiritual dimensions as well. Ancient China developed equally sophisticated but very different approaches. Traditional Chinese medicine viewed health through the balance of forces such as yin and yang and the harmonious movement of qi throughout the body. Within this framework, sleep represented a period when the body restored internal balance. Physicians observed that emotional states, seasonal changes, diet, and daily routines all appeared to influence sleep quality. While these concepts differ fundamentally from modern physiology, many practical recommendations emphasized regular habits, moderate eating before bedtime, and attention to environmental conditions. Once again, observation often produced useful guidance, even when theoretical explanations followed entirely different pathways. Similar patterns appeared in ancient India, where Ayurvedic traditions regarded sleep as one of the essential pillars supporting health, alongside nutrition and balanced living. Ayurvedic texts discussed appropriate sleeping times, seasonal adjustments, body position, and the influence of individual constitution upon rest. Some recommendations align loosely with modern findings, while others reflect philosophical systems unique to their cultural context. Separating enduring observation from historical interpretation remains challenging, yet that challenge itself reveals something important. People everywhere noticed that sleep affected nearly every aspect of life, even if they disagreed profoundly about why. Position during sleep generated endless discussion across civilizations. Some traditions recommended lying on one side, others favored different orientations based on symbolic, spiritual, or medical reasoning. In medieval Europe, physicians working within humoral medicine sometimes advised particular sleeping positions to encourage digestion or balance bodily fluids. Similar recommendations appeared in other parts of the world for entirely different reasons. Modern research confirms that sleeping position can influence conditions such as acid reflux, snoring, and certain breathing disorders. Although many historical explanations for these observations no longer hold scientific support, once again, useful practice sometimes emerged independently from inaccurate theory. Another fascinating subject involved the direction people faced while sleeping. In several cultures, beliefs developed regarding the orientation of the bed in relation to cardinal directions, mountains, rivers, or sacred spaces. Chinese feng shui eventually incorporated elaborate guidance concerning bedroom arrangement and bed placement. Similar traditions appeared elsewhere through different cultural frameworks. Scientific evidence supporting many directional claims remains limited or absent, yet these practices often encourage broader principles that modern designers still appreciate, such as reducing unnecessary noise, improving airflow, creating calm environments, and establishing psychologically comforting sleeping spaces. Sometimes, traditions preserved practical wisdom alongside symbolic meaning, making them difficult to evaluate through simple categories of true or false. The night itself shaped human sleep in ways modern people rarely experience. Before electric lighting, darkness arrived gradually and transformed entire communities. Firelight, candles, and oil lamps illuminated only limited spaces. Historians studying medieval and early modern Europe have proposed that many people may have practiced segmented sleep, waking naturally for an hour or two during the middle of the night before returning to sleep until dawn. Historical diaries, court records, and literary references occasionally mention a first sleep and second sleep, suggesting this pattern may have been relatively common in some regions. Other scholars caution that evidence remains incomplete and may not represent universal practice. Nevertheless, the possibility reminds us that modern, uninterrupted 8-hour sleep may not be the only historical norm. Artificial lighting fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with darkness in ways still being explored today. Physicians throughout history also notice connections between emotional well-being and sleep. Anxiety, grief, fear, and sadness often disrupted rest. Although ancient medicine lacked concepts such as neurotransmitters or circadian rhythms, countless observers recognized these relationships through lived experience. A troubled mind rarely slept peacefully. This simple observation appears repeatedly across philosophical writings, religious texts, medical treatises, and literature from civilizations separated by continents. Human psychology proved remarkably consistent, even when explanations differed dramatically. Modern neuroscience now reveals intricate interactions among stress hormones, emotional regulation, memory processing, and sleep architecture, but the underlying observation itself required no laboratory to recognize. Perhaps the greatest limitation facing every ancient physician was invisibility. They could observe sleeping bodies, but not sleeping brains. Dreams left no physical traces. Memory formation could not be measured. Electrical activity remained unimaginable. Without microscopes, imaging technologies, or experimental neuroscience, they stood outside one of biology's most complex systems, attempting to understand it through behavior alone. Considering those limitations, some of their insights appear remarkably perceptive. Others seem strangely imaginative. Most fall somewhere in between, reflecting sincere attempts to explain mysteries hidden beyond the reach of available tools. Even today, despite extraordinary advances, sleep science continues evolving. Researchers still debate the precise functions of dreams, the complexities of consciousness, and the many biological processes unfolding during sleep. We have answered far more questions than Hippocrates or Galen ever could, yet important mysteries remain. That continuity across thousands of years creates an unexpected connection between ancient observers and modern scientists. Both stared at sleeping humans and recognized something extraordinary taking place behind closed eyes. One worked with philosophy and careful observation. The other employs magnetic resonance imaging, genetics, and computational neuroscience. Yet both ultimately pursued the same timeless question: what exactly happens while we sleep? Looking back across this long history, it becomes clear that humanity's understanding of sleep has always advanced through a mixture of careful observation, creative interpretation, and gradual correction. Beds changed, bedding improved, medical theories evolved, civilizations rose and disappeared. But one truth quietly persisted through every era. Sleep remained essential long before anyone fully understood why. And perhaps that realization prepares us for the final chapter of this story, where the bed itself emerges not merely as furniture or cultural tradition, but as one of the most quietly influential technologies ever created, an invention that has shaped health, architecture, privacy, family life, and even the course of civilization itself. At first glance, a bed seems like one of the least remarkable inventions in human history. It has no moving parts, no engine, no blade, no wheel, no flame. It does not transport us across continents or harvest fields or connect cities. It simply waits in silence, asking almost nothing of us except that, sooner or later, we return to it. Yet, if every bed on Earth suddenly disappeared tonight, civilization itself would begin to unravel with astonishing speed. Hospitals would struggle to care for patients. Families would lose one of the most important spaces inside the home. Soldiers, sailors, scientists, and astronauts would all face the same problem. Every human being, regardless of language, wealth, or culture, must eventually surrender to sleep. The bed has quietly become one of the most universal technologies ever created, not because it changed how we work, but because it changed how well we recover before we work again. Looking back across thousands of years, one pattern appears again and again. Every improvement in the history of the bed solved a real problem. Grass mattresses reduced heat loss. Raised platforms escaped damp ground and crawling insects. Egyptian craftsmen refined sleeping furniture for hotter climates. Roman builders integrated beds into everyday domestic life. Medieval carpenters enclosed sleepers inside warm, protective canopies. Across Asia, the Americas, Africa, and the Arctic, countless communities designed sleeping systems that reflected their own landscapes rather than copying someone else's solutions. None of these inventions happened by accident. Together, they formed a continuous chain of adaptation, stretching from prehistoric camps to modern bedrooms. Each generation inherited yesterday's solution, improved it slightly, and quietly passed it forward. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the bed is something it prevents, rather than something it creates. By separating people from cold, damp ground, it reduced exposure to moisture that encourages mold, bacteria, parasites, and insects. By improving insulation, it allowed the body to conserve energy that would otherwise be spent maintaining warmth. By supporting more stable sleep, it may have contributed, even if indirectly, to stronger immune systems, better healing, clearer thinking, and healthier development. Modern science now confirms that sleep influences nearly every major biological system. During sleep, memories are strengthened, hormones are regulated, damaged tissues begin repairing themselves, immune responses become more effective, and countless neurological processes unfold beyond conscious awareness. Ancient people did not understand these mechanisms, yet generation after generation kept improving the place where those invisible processes occurred. In doing so, they unknowingly invested in one of the body's most essential forms of maintenance. The relationship between the bed and health becomes especially visible during illness. For centuries, long before modern hospitals existed, recovery usually happened at home. The bed became the center of treatment. Family members gathered around it. Physicians visited it. Medicines were prepared beside it. Children were born in it. Elderly relatives often spent their final days within it. Even today, hospitals devote extraordinary attention to beds. Modern hospital beds appear vastly different from ancient wooden frames, yet their purpose remains surprisingly familiar. They protect the patient, support healing, reduce unnecessary strain, and create an environment where recovery becomes more likely. Adjustable frames, pressure-relieving mattresses, infection-resistant materials, and specialized positioning systems all represent the latest chapter in a story that began with simple layers of grass spread across cave floors. Architecture itself changed alongside the bed. Once sleeping became associated with a dedicated piece of furniture, homes gradually evolved around it. Separate bedrooms emerged over centuries, though not uniformly across every society. Privacy acquired new meaning. Families developed routines centered around waking, resting, and retiring for the night. Interior design increasingly reflected the importance of sleep. The bedroom, now considered one of the most personal spaces in modern homes, owes its existence to countless historical decisions about where and how people should rest. Without the bed, the modern concept of domestic privacy might have developed very differently. The bed also reshaped family life in subtle ways. Throughout much of history, families slept together for practical reasons: warmth, safety, limited space, or economic necessity. As housing changed and beds became more accessible, sleeping arrangements gradually diversified. Children eventually occupied separate sleeping spaces in many societies. Couples developed private bedrooms. Guests received dedicated rooms. Cultural expectations surrounding marriage, childhood, independence, and household organization all evolved alongside changing sleeping environments. Of course, these developments unfolded differently around the world, and many traditions continue to value shared sleeping arrangements today. The point is not that one system replaced another, but that the bed influenced how people organized their closest relationships in ways that often go unnoticed. Economic history carries the bed's fingerprints as well. Entire industries emerged around sleep. Farmers raised sheep whose wool became blankets and mattresses. Flax growers cultivated fibers for linen sheets. Cotton plantations transformed global textile production, though often through deeply troubling systems of forced labor, whose consequences still echo through history. Carpenters specialized in furniture making. Blacksmiths forged metal fittings. Weavers, spinners, upholsterers, feather collectors, merchants, and traders all contributed to an economy built partly around improving the quality of human rest. Something as ordinary as a mattress supported vast networks of labor extending across continents. By the modern era, the sleep industry had become one of the largest sectors of household manufacturing, yet its origins remained rooted in ancient practical needs. The military offers another unexpected example. Armies have always understood that exhausted soldiers make poor decisions. Throughout history, military campaigns repeatedly demonstrated that rest influences discipline, judgment, morale, and physical endurance. While commanders often emphasize speed and surprise over comfort, successful armies still devoted significant effort to organizing camps, distributing bedding, and protecting troops from exposure whenever possible. The bed, even in its simplest portable form, became another tool supporting survival. The same principle later extended to exploration. Polar expeditions depended upon carefully engineered sleeping systems capable of preserving body heat. Sailors crossing oceans modified hammocks and bunks to function aboard constantly moving ships. Mountaineers refined insulated sleeping equipment for extreme altitudes. Every new environment forced humanity to redesign the ancient relationship between body and bed. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in space. When astronauts travel beyond Earth, gravity itself disappears. Traditional beds become meaningless because there is no floor to rest upon. Instead, astronauts sleep inside secured sleeping bags attached to walls or ceilings of spacecraft. Yet despite this dramatic change, the underlying challenge remains familiar. The body still requires regular, restorative sleep. Temperature must still be regulated. Noise, lighting, and comfort still matter. Humanity's newest sleeping environment turns out to be another variation on an ancient problem. Whether resting inside a prehistoric cave or orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth, humans continue searching for the same thing, a place where the body feels secure enough to surrender consciousness for several hours. Modern sleep science has also begun revealing something our ancestors could only suspect. The quality of sleep often matters as much as its quantity. Mattress support influences spinal alignment. Temperature affects sleep stages. Noise interrupts deep, restorative sleep, even when people fail to remember waking. Light exposure influences circadian rhythms through complex hormonal pathways involving melatonin and other biological signals. These discoveries have inspired entirely new generations of mattresses, pillows, cooling fabrics, adjustable frames, and sleep technologies. Yet beneath all this innovation lies an ancient principle that has never changed. The environment surrounding the sleeper matters. Every civilization reached that conclusion long before neuroscience explained why. There is an interesting irony here. Humanity has devoted extraordinary creativity to improving sleep, yet we still spend roughly 1/3 of our lives unconscious. For all our technological achievements, we cannot negotiate with biology. We cannot permanently eliminate sleep, postpone it indefinitely, or replace it with something more efficient. The need to sleep remains among the most universal constraints ever imposed upon our species. In that sense, the bed is not merely furniture, it is an acknowledgement of our limits. It reminds us every evening that even the most ambitious civilization eventually pauses. Looking back, it becomes difficult to identify a single inventor of the bed because no such person appears to exist. There was no sudden breakthrough, no famous workshop, no legendary craftsman who changed history overnight. Instead, millions of anonymous individuals contributed tiny improvements across thousands of generations. Someone gathered softer grass, someone tied stronger ropes, someone raised a platform higher above the ground. Someone discovered that feathers trapped warmth more effectively than straw. Someone realized that curtains held heat inside a sleeping space. Someone experimented with cleaner linens. Someone carved a better pillow. History rarely remembers their names, yet nearly every person alive today sleeps because of their accumulated ingenuity. In many ways, the bed represents the purest form of human innovation. It evolved not through dramatic revolutions, but through patient observation, repeated across countless ordinary lives. There is another reason the bed deserves to be called a technology. Technologies are often defined as tools that extend human capabilities beyond natural limitations. A bridge allows us to cross rivers we cannot swim. Clothing protects us from climates our bodies cannot tolerate alone. Fire permits survival through cold winters. The bed belongs in this same category. It extends our ability to recover, remain healthy, and inhabit environments that would otherwise make restful sleep far more difficult. Its greatest achievement is almost invisible because success leaves so little to notice. A good bed disappears from our awareness the moment sleep arrives. Perhaps that is why its history is so rarely told. We celebrate inventions that produce noise, movement, or spectacle. The bed does the opposite. It succeeds through silence. And yet, when viewed across the vast timeline of human civilization, few objects have influenced daily life more consistently. Every king, farmer, merchant, philosopher, sailor, scientist, and child has eventually sought the same quiet destination at the end of the day. The forms changed, the materials changed, the beliefs surrounding sleep changed. But the need never did, and perhaps that is the most remarkable conclusion of all. The story of the bed is not really the story of furniture. It is the story of humanity learning, one generation at a time, how to protect its most vulnerable hours. From scattered grass on the floor of an ancient cave to carefully engineered mattresses designed with advanced materials, every step followed the same simple ambition: to make tomorrow possible by surviving and eventually sleeping a little better through tonight. The next time you lie down, without giving your bed a second thought, it may be worth remembering that beneath the sheets, the mattress, the frame, and the pillow rests one of the oldest technologies still quietly shaping human civilization every single night. Thank you for spending your time with Sleepy Earth. If you enjoyed this journey, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed for more relaxing history. Let me know in the comments what topic you'd like to explore next. Until then, I wish you a peaceful night, sweet dreams, and all the best. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.